All right, let's dive into something that might sound a little counterintuitive. We're going to explore this idea that our obsession with trust in politics, well, what if it's actually the problem, not the solution? You know this story, right? A political scandal blows up, a minister makes a huge blunder, or a big policy just completely fails. It's that same frustrating feeling, and it always kicks off the exact same narrative. We hear the same excuses every single time. It was a one-off, a bad apple, just an unfortunate blip on the radar. The whole thing gets framed as this temporary detour from a path that's otherwise perfectly fine. And the solution that gets trotted out? We just need to restore trust. Trust in the system, trust in our leaders, trust in Parliament. It sounds so noble, doesn't it? But somehow it always seems to land us right back where we started. So let's just pause for a second and actually ask, when we're talking about trust in politics, what are we really talking about? Is it something we can measure, or is it something a lot fuzzier? Well, in this context, trust is basically a belief. It's the faith that the people in charge will, play by the unwritten rules, that they'll act with some integrity, and won't just push their power to the absolute limit simply because they can get away with it. And for a huge chunk of its history, the British political system was pretty much built on this idea. The whole thing was supposed to work because the people inside it were, quote-unquote, good chaps who understood the rules of the game and would basically police themselves. But here is where it gets really interesting. What happens when the system's main goal isn't actually being robust, but just appearing trustworthy? What happens when protecting the reputation of the system becomes way more important than actually fixing its flaws? You end up with this really dangerous spiral. A problem comes up, but admitting there's a problem starts to feel like you're attacking the institution itself. So instead of dealing with the issue head-on, the system just closes ranks to protect its image, and that ends up preserving the original weakness. And that's the huge irony in all of this. In the name of looking trustworthy, the system ends up protecting its most fragile, broken parts. It encourages everyone to stay quiet instead of speaking up early and making things right. This brings us all the way back to that story we tell ourselves, that these big failures are just rare exceptions to the rule. But what if that basic assumption is just completely wrong? And here's the real kicker. When you actually look at the history, serious failures at the highest levels of government, they aren't anomalies. They are a predictable, reoccurring feature of the whole system. The numbers really back this up. If you look at the last few decades, a surprisingly high number of cabinet ministers have had to resign under a cloud, and it doesn't matter which party is in power. This isn't a fluke, it's a pattern. And yet, the conversation always seems to drift back to this same old idea, that the problem isn't the system, it's the people. That all we need to do is find individuals with better character, higher standards. But that totally misses the point. I mean, seriously, think about it. We don't build a plane and just trust it'll fly. We engineer it with backups for the backups. But when it comes to how we're governed, we often just rely on a handshake and good faith. It's a logic we would never, ever accept in any other critical part of our lives. And that just highlights this massive disconnect. When we design, say, a banking system, we assume people might make mistakes or even act selfishly, so we build in hard rules, checks, and consequences. But with Parliament, we're often just hoping that goodwill and character will be enough. It's like building a skyscraper out of good intentions. So it's pretty helpful to take a look around and see how other countries handle this exact same problem. Now, no system is perfect, but it's really clear that the UK's deep reliance on these informal, unwritten rules is pretty unusual. This shows you two completely different ways of seeing failure. In the UK model, when a rule is broken, it feels like this deep moral betrayal. The public outcry is all about restoring faith. But in other systems, there's this built-in assumption that power can be abused. So when it happens, it's not a shock, it's a confirmation. And the response is to go back and check the rules of the system itself. So to be really clear, the argument isn't that trust is a bad thing. Of course it's not. The problem is that trust is a really fragile building material. And when you ask it to be the main support beam holding up the entire structure, it is absolutely going to crock under pressure. And relying on it this much has some really clear consequences. You get a system that's terrible at hearing bad news early. It's hesitant to make rules stricter because doing so feels like an accusation. And it always defaults to blaming an individual scandal instead of looking at the design of the system itself. This leads us to a much stronger, more resilient way to think about trust. Real, meaningful trust isn't the foundation of a good system. It's the fantastic byproduct you get when you have a system that is strong enough to work, even when trust isn't there. So, where does all this leave us? Well, it presents us with a pretty fundamental choice about how we want our government to work, and maybe more importantly, how we respond when it inevitably messes up. And that's the real question to mull over. If failure is a routine, predictable part of the system, and our constant focus on trust is actually making things weaker, are we just dealing with a few bad apples? Or are we clinging to this cozy idea of trust because the alternative, actually redesigning the rules of the game, feels much, much harder? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me for this one.